Ladies and gentlemen, today we have an epic quest ahead of us. Over the last 230 years, there have been 27 changes, or 27 amendments, added to the United States Constitution. Well, it's our job today, in hopefully just over a half hour, to try and run through each one of those different amendments and make sure that we understand what they did, the historical context to them, and maybe, the most important part, how we can possibly try and wrap our heads around all of those different amendments and actually keep them straight. Now, I'm not going to ask you to memorize them the first time you've heard these from day one, but there are some tips and tricks that we can do that where by the end of the year, I think you're going to have all of these down. Now, I'm going to post, or I have posted, into Canvas, posted a note sheet that you can use to follow along with this. Now, you can do this one of two ways. Right? You can either print this sheet off and just write your answers in there. If you want to, if you want to, make a copy of it, and you can make each of the different columns a little bit bigger if you know that you're going to write a fair amount in each one, right? But you can use this as the basis for your notes just by printing it off. If you don't have access to a printer, no big deal. Just take a piece of paper, turn it on its side. You're probably going to need a couple of them, but turn it on its side. And then at that point, just write each of the headings that you see here. Amendment number, and then you know it's going to be amendments number 11 through 27 for today. And then topic and theme. So what's the big topic or theme of each of the different amendments? Description and major points of the amendment. And then how can you remember? Like, what are the mnemonic little reminder sort of things that we can do to keep all of those straight? And then you can just take all of your notes as you go through. Now, to be able to turn this in, what you're going to be doing is taking a picture of the notes that you have actually made and then uploading those to turn that in as kind of like your proof of completion and just showing how epically awesome all of this was. Now, we are just under 2 minutes in, and here's the goal. In just under a half hour, I'm hoping that we can run through all 27 of these amendments that have been passed, again, over the last 230 years of U.S. history. So here we go. I'm going to cheat just a little bit here with the first 10. With the Bill of Rights, we've already studied through those. And we know this whole thing came about with a big fight between the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. What you really need to make sure that you know is that those Anti-Federalists demanded a Bill of Rights. They knew that the Bill of Rights would limit the power of government. Key word there, it limits the power of government. The Constitution itself gives power to the government, but the Bill of Rights says the government cannot do certain things or cannot take things away from you, right? You have your rights spelled out in the Bill of Rights. And so those run all across the gamut where we have the First Amendment, free speech, free press, free religion, freedom to peaceably assemble. The Second Amendment says that you have the right to bear arms. The third guarantees that you are not going to have any person from the United States military forced to be housed inside of your house during times of peace. The Fourth Amendment has several major parts to it, but it's largely about search and seizure laws. And then also what constitutes a valid warrant. When can the police actually enter your house or your automobile or things of that sort? They have to have a valid warrant for it. The Fifth Amendment's another one that covers a ton of different territory, but what we're going to focus upon for this is you have the right against self-incrimination. Basically, you have the right to remain silent. You do not have to say anything that would incriminate or prove that you are guilty. You're also protected here against double jeopardy. You cannot be tried for the same exact crime twice, and so you have protections against double jeopardy. It does go on to do other things like provide for eminent domain and certain things as well, but again, those are going to be our big ones that we focus on here with like the rights of the accused. At number 6, says that you have a right to a speedy trial, and you have the right to counsel. You have the right to an attorney. We now know that if you cannot afford one, one will be provided. Wasn't always the case in the United States history, but according to the Sixth Amendment, you have always had the right to an attorney and to a speedy trial in your criminal cases. The Seventh Amendment says that in certain types of cases, if the dollar amount at argue is over $20, you have the right to a jury trial. Right? The Eighth Amendment says that we cannot have excessive fines or excessive bail, and you're protected against cruel and unusual punishment. Now, for numbers 9 and 10, both of these deal with limiting the powers of the government. Number 9 relates to individuals and says that you have certain rights that are not listed in the Constitution, okay? You have certain things that are not listed in the Constitution. Just because it's not there doesn't mean you also can't have other rights as well. Number 9 is for individual people. Number 10 sort of spells out the same sort of principle, but for states. It says in number 10 that if a power was not given directly to the United States government, it's one that's going to be held on to by the state governments. And that, friends, is all about federalism, that relationship between the national government and the state governments and how they get on with each other. Now, for the big focus of what we're doing here, we have to work through 17 amendments, and I've got about 25 minutes left on my 30-minute timer here to try and make sure that we can get through each one of these. So the 11th Amendment is going to be another that relates to states. Now, imagine I could tell you that you could make an amendment that says you were never allowed to be sued. You couldn't be taken to court and stuff, and had somebody force you to give them money. If you could pass that amendment, would you want to? Well, of course you would. Well, the same thing was true for the states. The 11th Amendment relates to this court case called Chisholm v. Georgia. Chisholm was some dude, I think he was from South Carolina, not positive on that, but some dude who sued the state of Georgia over a land dispute, and Georgia lost. So almost immediately after the Bill of Rights has been passed, those first 10 amendments, the states realized, wow, this really stinks. We could be taken to federal court, and we could then lose in a federal court. These are states that used to be sovereign, mind you, so they were used to being able to be in control of their own affairs. So they all banded together, and those states then agreed that they would make the first change after the Bill of Rights. And the first thing you would want to do after making a Bill of Rights would be to pass an amendment that says you couldn't be sued. So with the 11th Amendment, because of that court case, Chisholm v. Georgia, the states can no longer be sued or taken to court within federal courts. You'd have to take them within you can't take them into the federal courts. With the 12th Amendment comes about because of the election of 1800. Right? Now, remember, our first president, George Washington, was not actually part of a political party. And he gave us this passing advice where he said, I really don't think it would be a good idea for us to evolve into factions, and to separate into different parties. It's probably a bad idea. And so being Americans, naturally, the first thing that we did once George was gone after his second term was we split up into two different parties. Now, it wasn't an issue at first in 1796. In that year, John Adams was elected president, and his vice president was a guy named Thomas Jefferson. Right? It used to be that the first place person was president, that was Adams, and then the second place person was the vice president, which was weird when you think about it and stuff. But where this all came to a head, in the election of 1800, it proved to be a problem. The Anti-Federalists got really smart and realized that if they ran multiple candidates, they could win both the presidency and the vice presidency. They could get both the first and the second place votes and have both of those offices tied up for the Anti-Federalists. There was one small problem. When the Electoral College went to go make their vote, the electors, one of them was supposed to not vote for one of the two Anti-Federalists, Aaron Burr. Right? They were just supposed to vote for Thomas Jefferson, but they screwed up. And all of the Anti-Federalists that were voting there voted for both Thomas Jefferson, an Anti-Federalist, and voted for Aaron Burr, also kind of an Anti-Federalist, right? So we've got two Anti-Federalists who tied in this election of 1800. Now, it goes to the House of Representatives. This is in the Constitution, that if there is a tie or no one gets a majority in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives, voting by state, will get to choose who the president is actually going to be. Well, there was vote after vote after vote, and it was uncertain who this president was going to be. So they pretty early realized, we need to change how we do this whole election thing for president. And they passed the 12th Amendment. Now, here's what you write for how you remember this one. It used to be first place person was president. First place, there's a number 1 there. Second place person was vice president. When you have first place president, second place vice president, putting the 1 and the 2 together, that makes the number 12. The 12th Amendment says it will no longer be first place president, second place vice president. Instead, they do it like we do now, where people are going to vote in the Electoral College. They'll cast one ballot for the president, and then in a totally separate election sort of thing, they cast a ballot for the vice president as well. Right? So it's not first place president, second place vice president, which is a good thing because many of our elections recently, that would have been really, really awkward if you had both of those people working together. But instead, we now say Electoral College, cast your votes for the president, and then separately, cast your votes for the vice president. No longer first place president, second place president, vice president, because of the 12th Amendment. With the 13th Amendment is part of this group of amendments that we call the Reconstruction Amendments. Now, from Civil War history or from American history, the Civil War was fought largely over slavery. And so many of these Civil War amendments or the Reconstruction era amendments are going to deal with reconstructing, rebuilding this country after that period of slavery was over. Now, I make the argument, and I think I'm right on this, that slavery is the most unlucky, the most unfortunate part of American history. We are very, very unlucky, I'm using that word on purpose, very unlucky that we ever had slavery exist within this country. Now, if you had to think about what the single most unlucky number is, in the whole lexicon of all the numbers that we have, the most unlucky number, according to our tradition, is the number 13. Right? We have Friday the 13th. Ooh, it's kind of a spooky day. Many buildings will not even put a 13th floor on their building, though you'll go on an elevator from the 12th floor to the 14th floor because it's just too unlucky to have that number 13 there. Well, the most unlucky part of American history was when we had slavery. So fortunately for us, the 13th Amendment does away with that unlucky period. The 13th Amendment bans slavery and involuntary servitude. Okay, no more slavery nor involuntary servitude are allowed within the United States as a result of the 13th Amendment. Now, how do we remember that? Well, 13 is a super unlucky number, and slavery was a really, really unlucky part of American history. So the 13th Amendment does away with that. Now, we thought that was going to correct most of our problems, and finally, now that we don't have slavery, everybody will be treated equally. But as you know, that didn't happen at all for the 19th century. So we had to go back to the drawing board. And when they realized that just banning slavery didn't protect people's rights, the Congress decided to propose, and then the states passed, the 14th Amendment. That says the 14th Amendment is equal protection for all. Right? So that's what I'm going to put as like my description of what it is. We have equal protection of the law for everybody in the United States. You all have equal protection before the law. It also says that any person who is born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, right? So birthplace citizenship. If you were born on U.S. soil, you are now a U.S. citizen, which meant that for all of those slaves who weren't technically born citizens, they were born as property, they were born slaves, well, they are now citizens of the United States with all the rights and everything due accorded to them. The 14th Amendment. Equal protection for all. This is a really, really big amendment that we cite all of the time, even up to this day today. The other thing that it does, when the Constitution was first written and we adopted that Bill of Rights, many people believed the Bill of Rights only dealt with limiting the power of the national government, right? They didn't see it as something that would actually bind the state governments. Well, the 14th Amendment, in an effort to try and protect many oppressed classes across the country, it includes this doctrine of incorporation. Okay, the doctrine of incorporation. Now, what that means is the states are now incorporated and brought into the Bill of Rights and these constitutional amendments. So every state now must also follow the Bill of Rights because of that doctrine of incorporation with the 14th Amendment. Right? Now, I'm going to come back here in a minute to how you can remember 13, 14, and 15 with it. So give me just a second and we'll get to it. With the 15th Amendment, now again, we think, okay, finally, we have solved all of our different problems here. What we did first was, well, we ended slavery. That should do it, but it didn't. Then we guaranteed equal protection for all. That should do it, but it didn't. And so the 15th Amendment came about as our first really big expansion of suffrage rights. Suffrage means the right to vote. It's an important term. Suffrage means the right to vote. Well, the first group to get suffrage rights with the 15th Amendment is going to be African American men. Okay, so you said that what the amendment's going to say is that you cannot deny a person the right to vote based on their race, their color, or their condition of previous servitude. That would mean like if they were previously a slave. So you're not allowed to ban somebody from voting just based upon that. Now notice, it doesn't say anything about gender. It doesn't say anything about age. So the reality was this gave the right to vote to African American men. So we had gone from a period where it was universal white male suffrage early in the 19th century or early in the 1800s. Now by the mid to late 1800s, we have universal malehood suffrage. All men over the age of 21 were eligible to vote after the 15th Amendment. Now, how can you keep these guys straight? Well, remember that number 13. If you can remember that as your starting place, you can get the other three down. And you go, oh yeah, 13 is unlucky. Slavery, we were really unlucky that we ever had slavery within the United States. Well, 13, 14, and 15 can then all go together. Because when we ended slavery, right, and we were so fortunate that we did, when we ended slavery, that made people free. You're no longer a slave, you are now free. What the 14th Amendment does is it defines what it means to be a citizen. If you're born in the United States, you are a citizen and you have equal protection before the laws. So we have free, 13th Amendment, citizens, 14th Amendment, and then for the 15th Amendment, you know what free citizens really love to do? Free citizens vote. 13, 14, 15. Free, 13, citizens, 14, vote. And if you can keep that mnemonic straight, just remember the 13th unlucky sort of thing. And I also realized that it was way more than luck and stuff that dealt with slavery. It's just for the mnemonic trying to remember it purposes within here. But that 13, 14, 15, free citizens vote. And I think you can keep those straight. Now we enter into, after this period of Reconstruction, if you remember back in U.S. history, the next period that kind of comes is this period of industrialization and urbanization, which brought great wealth and all sorts of opportunity and things to the United States. but it also raised some serious challenges. And so free 13 citizens, 14 vote. Free citizens vote, 13, 14, 15. Now, as I was mentioning, after Reconstruction, when the United States starts going through industrialization, when we start going through urbanization, we're creating factories, people are moving to cities, and we're starting to look a lot more like what modern society looks like, well, it created a lot of different challenges. And the group that came about to try and help fix many of those challenges were called the Progressives. And this becomes known then as the Progressive era. Now, the goal of the progressive movement was to try and fix these social, political, economic problems that were facing the country at that time. Right? There were certain social things, just relations amongst people and such, that were major issues. There were political problems. There were still groups that were not enfranchised. That means given the right to vote. There were still groups that could not legally vote within most of the United States. So social problems, political problems, and then economic problems. There were some problems with how we were funding the government, and they wanted to try and fix some of those. So what'd they do? Well, the Progressives came up with a series of amendments that we now call the Progressive Era Amendments. It starts with the number 16, right? Now, 16, if you know anything about what the 16th Amendment does, the United States government used to be funded in a weird way. It used to say that every single tax dollar that was collected or levied out to a state, it had to be commensurate or kind of like equal with a state's population. So you had some states that had very small populations, say Rhode Island. They wouldn't have to pay much in taxes, but a much larger state, say, what would be a good example for this one? It's bigger than Rhode Island. Let me say like Mississippi, right? So Mississippi would have to pay a lot more in taxes because maybe they have a lot more people than Rhode Island does. But there's a problem. Rhode Island is a pretty wealthy state per person. Mississippi is not necessarily. And so what we were having a problem with was many states that were bigger, that might be poorer, they were having to pay more money and stuff on this. So we said, we've got to find some way to make this fair, where you could be based more upon like how much money you make as opposed to how big your state itself is. The other thing to this was, and this is a big point, when we couldn't get enough money from all the states, one of the major ways that we tried to fund the government was with tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports. Now, when you put a tariff on goods, that then is added to the cost of that good, and it makes all the goods then more expensive. And so when you put a bunch of tariffs on things, the group that typically tends to hurt the most are often going to be those at lower income levels because they don't have a whole lot of extra money to be able to pay those taxes on the things that they're using and needing and stuff. So we needed some new kind of tax. And the 16th Amendment will give us that new tax. The reason I keep trying to stress that X, there are not many numbers nor words that come with the letter X in them. And if you've ever played the game Scrabble, it's the one where you get like little cubes that have like letters on them and stuff. And you get different points for different letters. So if you can make a word with the different letters that you have, you add up all the points, then that's how many you get for that word. Well, if you get the letter X in a Scrabble game, holy cow, you have a chance to make a ton of points because they're worth like 10 points because there aren't that many words that have that letter X in it. But I can give you a couple of them here. 16 has an X. There are not many words that have an X in it, but 16 does. So does the word tax. So what the 16th Amendment does is it makes it legal for the United States government to create an income tax. Now, instead of trying to pay for the government with tariffs, we don't have to do that. We could instead say, well, you're going to be taxed based upon how much money you make, an income tax. Instead of saying small states won't pay much, big states will have to pay a lot. Now we said, well, let's figure out like what the wealth is of each person within that state, and we'll just tax each person with the income tax. It was supposed to be a more fair way to try and run the country and get some money for the government here. So the income tax is created with the 16th Amendment, the first of those progressive era amendments. How do you remember that? Remember that letter X. There are not many words with the letter X, but tax does and 16 does too. Now, as we move along to the 17th Amendment, as we move along to the 17th Amendment, what the 17th Amendment is going to do is allow for the direct election of senators. Now, maybe you see what I just did there, right? It's not the number 17. This is now the number 17. I'm going to ask that you repeat it that way for the rest of the year. It will drive your math teachers crazy, but we're going to need it for government class. The 17th Amendment. When the Constitution was first made, We as people didn't actually get the ability to directly elect all of our senators. Instead, the senators were going to receive their jobs from the state legislature. So you would elect people to go work in, say, Columbus, Ohio, but then the members of our legislature in Ohio, in Columbus, would choose who our senators were going to be. Well, that ended up creating some problems. I mentioned in this age of industrialization, some businesses got really crazy successful, earned all sorts of money, and there might have been a little bit of corruption that went along with some of that too. So some of these different industries realized, hey, if we could buy off a state legislature, if we could pay enough people in that state legislature, we could then largely choose who the members of the United States Senate were going to be. Right? So you can see some really great political cartoons from that day. This guy Thomas Nast is drawing big industry, the oil industry, the steel industry, the railroad industry, controlling the United States Senate because the people themselves didn't have any real direct say over it. So what the 17th Amendment is going to do is allow for the people of each state to directly elect their own senators. How do you remember it? What's the 17th Amendment? Of course you're going to remember that deals with the Senate. The 17th Amendment deals with the direct election of senators. Now with the 18th Amendment, there are going to be two that are going to relate together here. The 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment. Okay? What the 18th Amendment does, this creates prohibition. Now, you probably studied this in American history, too. Prohibition was the area that bans the production, the transportation, or the sale of alcohol. Now, why is this a progressive era movement? Well, there are lots of different problems. Absenteeism at work, problems with families, many things that people attributed to too much alcohol use. And so the 18th Amendment was an effort to try and fix those social problems that the nation was seeing. And we did so then by banning the sale, production, transportation of alcohol with the 18th Amendment. I'm going to jump on down to the last one. You can't see it because my big old head here is blocking it and stuff. But where it says on the last bottom part of the page, the 21st Amendment will end this experiment of prohibition. Now, why do I jump forward all the way to this? Well, for one, it relates directly back to it. Right now, if you look at a copy of the Constitution, there's a line like drawn through the 18th Amendment because it's no longer there. It's no longer valid. We repealed it with the 21st Amendment. So the 18th Amendment creates prohibition. It bans the sale, transportation, or production, of alcohol. The 21st Amendment just repeals the 18th Amendment, takes it away. Well, how can you remember that? Well, think about it. Both 18 and 21, both those amendments deal with alcohol. And in U.S. history, there have been two major historic legal drinking ages. Today, to be able to drink, a person has to be 21 years of age. Back in the day, about 40 years ago or so, maybe a little bit more than that, but you would have had to have been 18 to be able to purchase alcohol legally, right? 18th Amendment. 18 used to be a legal drinking age, in the United States. 21 is now, and 21 also deals with alcohol. So two separate amendments that deal with alcohol in the Constitution, and they just so happen to match up with the two major drinking ages that we have had in U.S. history, 18 and 21. Okay? Now, the 19th Amendment happens around 1919. Technically, it was actually 1920, but hear me out on this. Around 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed to give women the right to vote. Okay? Now, I'm saying around 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed, because if we can put this into like its historical context, and you can remember what else was going on around 1919, it'll help. Plus, the more times I can say that number 19. Around 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed. I'm hoping it'll just kind of get etched into our brains and stuff, and we'll remember it that way. What the 19th Amendment does is it gives women the right to vote across the entire country. There were certain states that had already allowed women the right to vote, but at this point it now becomes nationally illegal to discriminate in voting based upon gender, a person's sex. Okay. Now, why does that pass in 1919? Actually, 1920. But why does it pass at this time? Well, in 1919, World War I came to an end, and women had played an absolutely critical role in the United States and the Allied victory in World War I. And many women were challenging the government prior to World War I, saying, we want the right to vote, we want the right to vote, we demand this right to vote and deserve this right to vote. And the government basically kind of said this little quid pro quo sort of thing. I am oversimplifying this for sure, but this is a quick thing trying to get it in under a half hour. Right? What the government could say was, all right, look, if you guys promise not to strike, if you promise to help us out with this, go along with this war effort. At that point, then, we will pass the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. once the war is over. Now, we're going to dig into this a little bit more and look at the entire story behind it, but if you can remember, it was as a result of World War I and many of the efforts that came along with that, and the vital role that many women played in the country during that time. As a result of World War I, that led to women getting the right to vote in the United States. Now, if you want to take a minute there and think about this, sometimes when we do history, we look back so far and it's all just something from a textbook. It's like, oh yeah, this happened ages ago. It's just so long ago. But think about that. It was 100 years ago. Right now, this is 2020 when I'm making this video. It was just 100 years ago that women were legally allowed to vote within the United States. Now, good news is we've came a long way since then and stuff, but it goes to show that, man, 100 years ago is not really that long, and it was only that 100 years ago that women all across the country were actually legally allowed to voice their opinions and take part within the American democracy and stuff, right? So there's been a big increase of that over time, but it's taken a lot of work from a number of individuals along the process there. Now, after the 1919 and the 19th Amendment that allowed women to vote, we jump to, naturally, the 20th Amendment. Now, for the 20th Amendment, the 20th Amendment came about. If you went back in the day, when we elected a president, the president would be elected in November. Okay, that's when we still have our elections today. So on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in the month of November, we go vote for the President of the United States. Now, back in the day, before the 20th Amendment, the president would not actually start. They would not be inaugurated or take their job until March of that following year. So you think about that. A president, just imagine we had some president we couldn't stand and we just really wanted to get rid of, right? Well, we vote them out in November, but they'd have all of November, December, January, February, and then into March that they would still be running the country. Now, the reason we used to give them that long was if you had to move and pack up all your stuff and get ready to take over the government in Washington, D.C. as a new president, it would take you a long time to get all that stuff ready and just get your things into Washington, D.C. The idea of even just trying to count the votes and everything would be a drawn-out process. But because by the 20th century, by the coming of the 1900s, we had big revolutions in transportation, things like the railroads. We had big revolutions in communication, telegraph lines going all along those railroads, connecting up the country, making it a much smaller place in many ways. Well, because of those changes to transportation and communication, we could move the presidential start date. So with the 20th Amendment, what this will do is it changes a president's inauguration, their first day in office, changes their inauguration from March back to January 20th. Now, there are two separate ways that you might be able to remember this. For one, maybe you're just good with numbers and you go, oh yeah, the president now starts on January 20th because of the 20th Amendment. See how those match up? January 20th is the first day for new presidents. The 20th Amendment is what made that be the case. It's no longer March. The other thing you could do, when we have a president who is serving out the rest of their term, but they are not being reelected. Okay, so they were voted out in November, but they're still actually ruling for a couple months thereafter. What we could call that person is a lame duck. Now, I've got the number 20 written here, and I want you to see what I'm going to do with this number 20. This is pretty amazing, all right? Look, that number 20 could pretty easily be changed to a 2 followed by a duck. Now, I know that's not a good duck. It's a pretty lame duck. But you can see how I could draw a beak and a little eye on there. And the number 20 now becomes a duck because this is the lame duck amendment. All right? The 20th Amendment says you aren't going to have as long of a lame duck period. That time where you've been voted out of office, but you're still there. We're not going to have as long of a lame duck period. So if you can remember the lame duck amendment and my picture of the lame duck, maybe that helps you with it. If not, try to remember the president now starts on January 20th, and it's the 20th Amendment that creates that change. All right, so 21 we already talked about because it was 18 and 21 that both dealt with alcohol, right? And they're both the legal drinking ages there throughout U.S. history. So we jump on ahead now to 22, and what kills me about the number 22 is simply how many 2s are within that number, right? There are so many 2s in the number 22, and they can help us to remember that because what the 22 Amendment, the 22nd Amendment is going to say is that presidents of the United States can now only serve 2 terms. Now, you might be going, hold up. I know that was a rule before because George Washington only served 2 terms, and so presidents have always served 2 terms, and you would be right, except for the fact about the rule. It was a tradition in American politics that no president would ever run for or serve more than 2 terms as president. But then, in 1928, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president of the United States. Okay, or I'm sorry, 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president of the United States. This is right in the middle of the Great Depression. It'd be a really tough time to be president of the United States. Roosevelt ran again in 1936. We're still in Depression. By the time that he was ready to go for a third term, World War II had broken out in Europe. Now, the United States wasn't in it just yet, but in 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, made the really historic decision that he was going to run for, and he ended up winning, a third term as president of the United States. Just because he wasn't done by 1944, the guy ran again. He was elected 4 times president of the United States. So just shortly thereafter, Congress got together and said, I don't know that we really want somebody to be president for more than 2 terms, and they passed the 22nd Amendment. How do you remember that? There's a lot of 2's in the number 22, and that means 2 terms. Only 2 terms because of the 22nd Amendment. With the 23rd Amendment, there was one part of the United States, actually where the president lives, that didn't have any say over who got to be the president of the United States. The District of Columbia did not have any electoral college votes. They could not vote for the president of the United States, ironically, even though the president actually lived within the United States. So what 23 is going to do, 23 gives 3 to D.C. Maybe that's how you remember that, right? 23 gives 3 to D.C. You can kind of say it like a little sing-song, a little rhyme there and stuff. 23 gives 3 to D.C. Now, maybe if you're a basketball fan, this might work for you. It does for me because I'm 1, old, and 2, I'm a basketball fan. To me, the greatest basketball player of all time was Michael Jordan. And Michael Jordan only played for 2 teams in his entire NBA career. He played for the Chicago Bulls for most of it. But late in his tenure, late in his career, he went to the Washington Wizards, Washington, D.C. Now, when I see that number 23, immediately I just think Michael Jordan, right? Because it was kind of etched into my brain growing up and stuff. If you're a basketball fan, that might be the same thing for you. Why is LeBron James number 23? Well, it's out of homage to Michael Jordan and stuff there, right? So 23, Michael Jordan, and Jordan only played for 2 teams. Now, the Chicago already had their electoral votes, so 23 gives 3 to D.C. Jordan and the Wizards there. Right? However it works for you and stuff. All right, we're getting down to it. With the 24th Amendment, the 24th Amendment is going to be passed as part of the Civil Rights Movement, actually. There were some states that were either using or were threatening to use poll taxes. Now, what a poll tax would mean was when you went into the polls, the place where you could vote, you might have to pay a tax to be able to do so. And that's a big problem. The idea that like your right to vote has something to do with the amount of money that you have. So we passed the 24th Amendment that says poll taxes are no longer going to be allowed to be used within the United States. So no more poll taxes because of the 24th Amendment. Now, if you need the way to remember this and stuff, you could say, as again the rhyming mnemonic sort of thing, 24 protects the poor. 24 protects the poor. Well, how so? Well, if I'm really worried about trying to buy milk and bread and put a roof over my family's head and stuff, if most of my money is going towards that, I might not have any extra money allowed to be able to help me vote, right, to pay that poll tax. So 24 protects the poor. And make sure that voting isn't just like a rich person's game. There are no poll taxes allowed within federal elections because of the 24th Amendment. 24 protects the poor. Again, we're getting down close here, guys, and I'm closing to my half hour. With the 25th Amendment, there was a president named Lyndon B. Johnson. He had just came to power after John F. Kennedy had been shot. He was Kennedy's vice president, actually. And after the country lost Kennedy, we were kind of nervous because Lyndon Johnson was this big guy, and he had historically had some heart problems. And what they started to worry about was, wow, what happens if the president had like a massive heart attack or something or other? Now, we know that if the president died, the vice president would be the next in charge. But medicine had come so far by the 1960s here when we're talking about this. It had come so far by the 1960s that in theory, a president could have a heart attack and be kept alive on life support. And there'd be this big constitutional question. Who's actually in charge of the country? A president who's stuck in a coma or the vice president who doesn't really take over until if the president dies? So the 25th Amendment will deal with presidential succession. Succession means who comes next, who succeeds, who follows somebody else. And what it says is the president can yield power. That's my arrow there. The president can yield power or give power to the vice president if the president can't lead. So if the president is having a major surgery, if the president gets very, very ill and just can't lead the country, or if the president happens to start to suffer from something like dementia. There were some people who were nervous that maybe Ronald Reagan was getting up there in his ages in his second term, and some people started saying, wow, well, what happened if a president started to lose control of their full faculties of their mind? Well, according to the 25th Amendment, a president can tag out. And that's the thing with that weird little GIF that's up there in the corner. If you've ever watched a professional wrestling match, I'm using my pros and my air quotes here, right? But to tag out in a tag team wrestling match, that means you say, hey, I can't go on. I've been getting beat up. I can't go on anymore. I need to tag out to my friend. We have to give a high five to be able to tag out. And lo and behold, the highest 25 out of our 27 amendments, the highest 5 in the entire Constitution is this dealing with presidential succession. So the 25th Amendment says that the president can tag out, can hand power over to the vice president if the president has found that he or she can't lead the country. Right? Now, the 26th Amendment comes to us by the 1970s. In the 1970s, a major war is going on all across the world in the Vietnam War. Now, one of the ironies of the Vietnam War here was many 18-year-old people, right, not much older than yourself, many 18-year-old people in the late 60s and 70s were being sent off to fight in the Vietnam War. Now, the ironic part was those same people who were being sent to fight, those men were not eligible to vote because in many states you had to be 21 years old to vote. So what happens here is 18-year-olds and young people all across the country started pushing for the right to vote to be changed down to 18. If I'm old enough to fight, I'm old enough to be sent off to war, I should be old enough to vote. And the nation agreed, and the 26th Amendment is ratified. Now, this is a little bit of a stretch in terms of our how do we remember this. But if you look at the numbers there, 2-6, that's the 26th number. But 2 plus 6 equals 18. I don't know. It's the best that I've got. 2 plus 6 at least gives us that 8. But I'm going to say, again, I'm going to mess with your math teachers here, 2 plus 6 equals 18 because the 2 plus 6 amendment, the 26th Amendment, gives 18-year-olds the right to vote. And so we've seen an extension of suffrage. We started off with just white men voting, and then by the 15th Amendment said, black men can vote too. And then by the 19th Amendment, around 1919, the 19th Amendment says now women can vote as well. And here with the 26th Amendment, we have our last big expansion to allow young people the right to vote. And 18 years old is set as like the maximum minimum age you're allowed to have, which means the state could lower it if they wanted to and stuff, but you cannot stop an 18-year-old from voting in the United States if they're a citizen of the United States. Now, that was passed, again, back in the 1970s. I look at voter turnout by age in that chart over on the right, and the blue line there shows the voter turnout rates for people between the ages of 18 to 29. Guys, this is unfortunate. But if we look at it, in every single electoral period through there, the voter turnout rate, the number of people who showed up to vote, was lower among younger people than it was among older groups. Now, what I am really hoping we can do is you can get this understanding of why voting is so important, how easy it is for you to do, and the role that you could play within the decisions the country makes, and you can help raise that blue line up against all those old people and make it to where young people are finally represented as they got the right to be with the 26th Amendment. Now, the last one of these amendments, and I think I might be just above my 30-minute time frame, but I've still got to go through this last one. The 27th Amendment was added to the Constitution in the early 1990s. This is the last one that we've added. We have not had one since then. It's kind of an interesting story. It was first proposed in the Bill of Rights. So James Madison puts together these Bill of Rights and says, hey, these things are pretty cool. And he added in this one that said, what becomes the 27th Amendment, it said, we don't want Congress to be able to just vote themselves a raise. What the 27th Amendment will say, if Congress gives itself a raise, if Congress votes to give itself a raise, that raise won't take effect until after the next election. So it's 2020, and let's say right before the November election, Congress gets together and says, we're going to vote ourselves a $1 million raise. They could do that. They control the finances of the country. But we get the chance to go vote. And if we feel like those people were being like kind of corrupt or bad about that and stuff, we could kick them all out, or at least most of them, kick them out of Congress. And so they wouldn't get the raise that they had voted themselves in. And so it's supposed to be a safeguard to keep Congress in check. Now you go, how in the world is that an interesting story? Well, it was proposed in the 1780s, proposed way back then, and it didn't pass. It was not part of the Bill of Rights, so it was never ratified by all of the states. But in the 1980s, there was a student, I believe it was at a small college in Texas, but this student who was like writing a term paper for his class, and he found out about this failed amendment, the Congressional Pay Amendment, that had not passed with parts of the Bill of Rights. And so the student then wrote this thing about how, wow, this could be cool. We could actually still bring this back. We could make this a new amendment once we get enough states to actually ratify it. Crazy thing is, it worked. The other crazy thing is, the kid came up with that really cool idea and tracked it down and got a C on the term paper. right? Now, a C on a term paper where you eventually get a new constitutional amendment, I think the kid deserves some justice. And allegedly, the university did go back and later change the grade to an A, like 30 years down the road or something there, right? But here's what happened. The kid thought it was interesting, wrote a term paper, got a C on it. That kind of fired him up. And so he said, look, I'm actually going to start running this campaign to try and get enough states to sign on with it. And after a series of years, about 10 years, I believe, at that point, enough states had. And so the Congressional Pay Act, or the Congressional Pay Amendment, you cannot get a raise until after the next election happens. It goes into effect as the 27th Amendment. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is a really, really quick run through the Constitution. I do not expect you to have every single one of those memorized right away, but as we practice those through time and you continue to use those same sort of stories with it, I'm telling you, here in a couple of months, you're going to amaze all of your friends and family by being able to spout out random constitutional knowledge like that. And that's a good thing.